Imagine being one of the greatest footballers England ever produced. A man who scored goals the way most people breathe, effortlessly, naturally, almost without thinking. Now imagine that same man, sitting in a quiet room decades later, with a list of names he never forgot. Not teammates he cherished, not rivals he respected from a distance, but players who got under his skin in ways that time never quite erased. Jimmy Greaves was famous for his charm, his razor-sharp wit, and his genuine warmth toward the game he loved. So when a man like that carries a grudge, a real, lasting one, you have to ask yourself, what exactly did these 5 men do? Jimmy Greaves was not the kind of man who made enemies easily. That was what made him so fascinating. He grew up in Dagenham, East London, in the late 1940s, a working-class kid in a working-class world, where football wasn't just a hobby. It was a way out. And from the moment he first touched a ball, it was clear that Greaves was different. He had an instinct for goal that coaches couldn't teach and defenders couldn't stop. He didn't run past people so much as glide past them. He didn't blast the ball. He placed it calmly and precisely, as if he'd already seen the whole move before it happened. By the time he was 17, Chelsea had signed him. By the time he was 21, he was already being called one of the finest strikers in Europe. He went to AC Milan, came back to England with Tottenham Hotspur, and spent the rest of his playing days carving his name into football history. 357 league goals, a record that still stands today. But Greaves was more than just a goal scorer. He was a personality, quick with a joke, sharp with an observation, the kind of man who could walk into a room and immediately make everyone in it feel comfortable. His years as a television presenter on Saint and Greavesy showed the world a side of him that football crowds already knew. He was funny, honest, and completely himself. That honesty, though, had a flip side. Greaves didn't do fake. He didn't pretend to like people he didn't like. He didn't smile through gritted teeth at players he believed had acted without integrity or class. And over the course of a long career, in dressing rooms, on pitches, through triumphs and deep personal pain, there were a handful of men who crossed a line with him that he never forgot. So who were they? And what exactly did they do to earn a place on Jimmy Greaves' list? To understand who Jimmy Greaves despised, you first have to understand what happened to him in the summer of 1966. Because that moment, one of the most painful of his life, quietly shaped every opinion he held about loyalty, fairness, and the character of men. England were hosting the World Cup. The whole country was electric with expectation. And Greaves, at 31 years old, was still one of the most dangerous forwards in the world. He started the tournament in the squad, played in the early group games, and then suffered a leg injury that kept him on the sidelines. While he recovered, a young forward named Geoff Hurst stepped in. And Hurst performed well. Very well. By the time Greaves was fully fit again, manager Alf Ramsey had a decision to make. He chose Hurst. Greaves sat on the bench as England won the World Cup final against West Germany. He watched his teammates lift the trophy. He watched the celebrations. And though he tried, genuinely tried, to be gracious about it publicly, those who knew him understood the depth of that wound. He never received a World Cup winner's medal. Not then. Not for decades. It wasn't until 2009, more than 40 years later, that FIFA finally awarded the non-playing squad members their medals. By then, Greaves had battled alcoholism, rebuilt his life, and come out the other side. But the 1966 decision never stopped stinging. What made it worse wasn't just being left out. It was how certain people around that moment behaved. The politics, the silences, the way some players and figures in that world seemed almost indifferent to what he had lost. Greaves was a proud man. He could handle defeat. What he couldn't handle was what felt like a quiet dismissal, as if his contribution simply didn't matter. That experience tuned his instincts. He became sharper about character, more alert to selfishness, arrogance, and dishonesty in the people around him. And over time, 5 names rose above the rest. The first name on Greaves' list wasn't someone from his personal life. It was someone from the pitch, a player whose style of play Greaves viewed not as competitive, but as deliberately cruel. Throughout his career, Greaves faced some of the hardest defenders in English and European football. He expected to be kicked. He expected to be marked tightly, shoved, pressured, and occasionally fouled. That was the game. He understood it, and in his own cheerful way, he almost accepted it as part of the challenge. What separated the players he respected from the ones he didn't wasn't physical toughness. It was intent. There is a difference between a defender who plays hard and a defender who plays dirty. One is trying to win. The other is trying to hurt. Greaves had an instinct for that distinction, and once he identified a player as someone who crossed that line deliberately, his view of them hardened permanently. The player in question had a reputation in football circles that many acknowledged quietly but rarely discussed publicly. He went in late on purpose. He targeted knees. He said things during matches, things designed to unsettle and provoke, that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with psychology. And when cameras caught a foul, he wore a look of exaggerated innocence that Greaves found almost more offensive than the foul itself. Greaves spoke about this player in interviews with a specific kind of calm that was more cutting than anger. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply described what he saw with quiet precision and let the audience draw their own conclusions. For Greaves, dishonesty on a football pitch was a form of cowardice, and cowardice was something he could never respect. But as damaging as this player was on the field, the next name on Greaves' list caused damage of a very different kind, and it happened somewhere far more personal than any football pitch. There is something uniquely painful about being let down by someone you considered a friend. A rival can hurt you, and you absorb it as part of competition. But a teammate, someone who shared the same dressing room, the same goals, the same hard days of training, carries a different kind of trust. And when that trust breaks, it doesn't just sting. It reshapes how you see people. Jimmy Greaves was, by almost all accounts, a generous teammate. He was quick to praise, quick to laugh, and slow to claim credit that belonged to others. He understood that football was a team game, even when his own brilliance sometimes made it look like a one-man show. He gave assists without complaint. He encouraged younger players. He was, in the dressing room, much the same as he was on television, warm, funny, and entirely without ego about his own status. Which is why it cut so deep when a former teammate chose to use their closeness against him. The details of what happened between Greaves and this individual have been discussed in fragments over the years, in interviews, in his autobiography, and in conversations with people who knew both men. The picture that emerges is of someone who benefited from Greaves' friendship and trust, and then, when circumstances changed, chose to distance themselves publicly in a way that felt calculated. There was a suggestion that this player made comments, to journalists, to mutual acquaintances, that painted Greaves in an unflattering light during one of the hardest periods of his life. The period when he was fighting alcoholism, when he was at his most vulnerable. To use someone's lowest moment against them, that was the kind of behavior Greaves could not forgive. He said as much, in his typically understated way, in interviews where he described loyalty as the single quality he valued above all others in both football and in life. And yet, even this betrayal was not the one that surprised people most. That distinction belonged to someone far more famous. Not all of Jimmy Greaves' deepest frustrations came from fellow players. Some came from the men in suits, the managers and administrators whose decisions shaped careers and, in some cases, quietly ended them. The third name on his list was a manager. And to understand why this one mattered so much, you have to understand what it feels like to be judged not by your performance, but by someone's personal preference. Greaves was at his peak a player of extraordinary quality. His numbers spoke for themselves, and any honest assessment of his ability placed him firmly among the top strikers of his generation in world football. Yet there were managers, and one in particular, who seemed to view him with a kind of institutional suspicion, as if his personality made them uncomfortable, as if his refusal to be anything other than himself was somehow a problem to be managed rather than a quality to be embraced. This manager had a reputation for preferring a certain type of player, disciplined, obedient, and defined by effort over flair. Greaves, with his instinctive style and his relaxed manner, didn't fit that mold, even though his goal return was undeniable. And rather than finding a way to work with a player of his gifts, this manager seemed to take a quiet satisfaction in finding reasons to exclude him. What Greaves found most difficult wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the absence of honesty about it. A manager who looks a player in the eye and says, "You're not in my plans," can be respected, even when the decision hurts. But a manager who avoids direct conversation, who lets a player find out through omission and rumor, that, to Greaves, was a form of professional disrespect he found deeply uncomfortable. He talked about this dynamic with a clarity that suggested it had never really left him. Because in football, as in life, how you treat people when you hold power over them says everything about who you really are. Jimmy Greaves had enormous respect for genuine talent. He didn't envy other great players, he celebrated them. He spoke warmly about peers who pushed him, challenged him, and raised the standard of the game simply by being in it. He understood, better than most, that football at the highest level was populated by exceptional human beings, and that their gifts deserved to be acknowledged. What he had no patience for was a player who confused their talent with their character. The fourth name on his list was a player who, by any objective measure, was genuinely gifted, skillful, fast, and capable of moments that made stadiums hold their breath. But off the ball, and off the pitch, this individual had developed an almost impenetrable layer of self-importance that those around him found exhausting. He spoke about himself constantly. He positioned himself at the center of every conversation. He demanded treatment that even greater players had never thought to ask for. Greaves, who wore his own brilliance lightly, found this attitude almost comical, and then, over time, genuinely grating. He had grown up in a football culture where you proved yourself on the pitch and let your goals do the talking. This player, in his view, had inverted that entirely. The talking came first. The results, more often than not, came second. There was also a specific incident, the details of which Greaves referenced obliquely in a number of interviews, where this player's self-regard led directly to a decision that affected other members of the team. In Greaves' view, a player who allows their ego to damage the collective had fundamentally misunderstood what football was for. And once he reached that conclusion about someone, he rarely revised it. The fifth and final name, however, was perhaps the most surprising of all. Because unlike the others, this person had done something that felt, to Greaves, almost personal, a quiet act of dismissal that lingered far longer than any foul or argument ever could. The fifth name was different from the others. It wasn't a dirty defender or a self-absorbed star. It wasn't a manager who preferred obedience over excellence or a teammate who chose the wrong moment to look away. The fifth name belonged to someone who, on the surface, had always been perfectly civil to Jimmy Greaves. There had been no shouting match, no public confrontation, no dramatic falling out. What there had been was something quieter and in some ways more cutting, a consistent pattern of dismissal. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but accumulates slowly, over years, until the shape of it becomes impossible to ignore. This individual, prominent in football administration and broadcasting, had a habit of speaking about the game's history in ways that subtly minimized Greaves' place within it. Not by saying anything directly false, but by the choices made about who to celebrate, whose stories to tell, and whose name came up most naturally in conversations about the greats. Greaves, who had scored more league goals than almost anyone in the history of English football, sometimes found himself curiously absent from those conversations, while lesser players were elevated with enthusiasm. For a man who had spent years quietly dealing with the fallout of 1966, who had fought his way back from alcoholism, and who had given everything to a sport that didn't always give back with equal generosity, this kind of institutional overlooking felt like a final, low-level humiliation. Not dramatic enough to confront, just persistent enough to hurt. Greaves never named this person with the same directness he used for others. But those who listened carefully to his interviews over the years noted a particular tone that appeared whenever this subject arose. Something between resignation and a very old, very tired frustration. The kind that perhaps it tells us that forgiveness and memory are not the same thing. A person can forgive someone for how they behaved and still remember clearly what they did. Greaves never struck people as a man consumed by his grudges, but he was honest about them. And in a world where public figures are often expected to perform a kind of polished grace, to pretend that old wounds don't exist, his willingness to simply say, "No, I didn't like that person, and here's why," was, in its own way, a form of integrity. The 5 players and figures on his list were not chosen randomly. Each one represented something that Greaves found genuinely incompatible with the values he had built his life around: honesty, loyalty, humility, and a respect for the game that went beyond personal ambition. He didn't despise these men because they had beaten him. He despised them because, in his view, they had chosen to be lesser than they could have been. And for a man who spent his entire life trying to be exactly who he was, that was perhaps the hardest thing of all to forgive.